Hey, thanks for making it to Veterans Info Tap. I'm glad you made it. Should the CPI-E be utilized to calculate COLA? There's actually an article here on Plan Advisor that I'm going to go ahead and go through. But before I do, I wanted to talk about the legislative process, right? Of course, we're going to have politicians that do things for votes, right? That they're going to be trying to do things to woo groups of people one way or the other for votes, and they'll introduce different types of legislation. Most every single benefit that we have was for two reasons. It was on the back of a veteran who probably lobbied for it, and two, on some legislator out there that decided to draft up some piece of legislation and push it out there and see if they could get it to pass. So to think for a second that we can accomplish it without that type of support, veterans lobbying for it, and politicians to actually kick it over the finish line is ludicrous, right? It takes all of that in order to make it happen. Now, the CPI-E is an interesting conversation regarding COLA. From the things that I've read, and I haven't read this article, I'm going to share it with you now. It's my understanding that on average, we as a veteran community and Social Security recipients would have realized on average about 0.25% higher per year. 0.25% by itself, not much. But think about it. It compounds just like compound interest, right? So as those increases happen, it's an increase on top of an increase on top of an increase. You're actually going to grow at a quicker clip. So with that, I'm going to also shine a few lights on some different pieces of legislation that have called to utilize the CPI-E. Well, guess what? If we, as a veteran community, want that, we should probably say something to our congressional elected officials by way of a phone call, stopping by their office, whatever it is, right? An email. Hey, I support utilizing the CPI-E. I hope you do too, or whatever it is, right? That's an important piece, right? Quiet mouths don't get fed. Many hands make light work, right? You come up with whatever you want to say, but it is absolutely true. So I'm going to jump into a few things. Please hit the thumbs up, subscribe, share with a friend, all that good stuff. I really appreciate it. And had some sort of spider thing flying around. That's fun. I really appreciate your support. The two asks, hit the thumbs up, let the video run. That's what helps put this into other people's hands and brings it to the awareness of maybe some others that should know. With that, if you want to support the channel in other ways, consider being a member. You can go to the homepage. You'll see highlighted members and a join button. Thank you so much to all you members. I truly appreciate you. All right. Whew. So with that, let's dive into a couple things with regard to different pieces of legislation. So just a quick little Google search pulled up, different things. So new bill changes how Social Security COLAs are calculated. That's a CPI-E on there. Talking about utilizing the CPI-E. There's another one where it's, I think it's Casey and colleagues. So Senator Bob Casey and colleagues introduce a bill to increase Social Security by utilizing the CPI-E. Another one, Garamendi reintroduces the Fair COLA for Seniors Act, which calls to utilize the CPI-E again. And there's many, right? So there's another one that was Gallego introducing his piece of legislation to utilize the CPI-E as well. So this is not a new thing, and there's been, 3 or 4 different pieces of legislation over the last, year and a half or so that have popped up regarding changing the way that COLA is calculated. Now remember, COLA is the cost of living adjustment. Cost of living adjustment. Typically, you're going to see an increase every year. There are some 0 years, but typically we'll see an increase to whatever you're receiving. So whether it's your VA disability compensation, your pension, your dependency indemnity compensation, your Social Security benefits, all of those things are impacted by COLA. Now, this article here, I'm going to jump into it. It says, and this just came out fairly recent, June 11th, 2024. Now, I don't know if they're going to say yes, we should, or no, we shouldn't. We'll find out along the way. So it says, should the CPI-E be used for Social Security? Now, what they mean is, should the CPI-E, the Consumer Price Index for the elderly, be the indice that is utilized to calculate COLA? That's what they're saying. Currently, it's the CPI-W. Different spending habits in those two categories within the broader CPI. So they are essentially, the argument or the question is, shouldn't it be geared more toward the elderly, which are typically the ones on Social Security and have different spending habits, maybe on healthcare and housing and such, more so than others? So let's dive into it. Using the Consumer Price Index for the elderly for cost of living adjustments would likely result in a higher Social Security benefit. Now, again, insert veterans benefits. Because why? Because Congress every year passes a law, or passes a bill, whatever, that becomes law, that allows the VA to mirror the Social Security cost of living adjustment. So, just by default, anything that happens for Social Security COLA then is defaulted to VA as well. Except for, side note, VA does its own calculation somehow of COLA for Chapter 35 and Veterans Readiness and Employment Benefits. The VA, figures those calculations out and implements that with a start date of October 1st of the year. And last year's, just for giggles, was 6.2%. Boy, that would have been great if they were able to calculate their whole thing for all of us. All right, moving on. The Congressional Research Service issued a report on the hypothetical use of the CPI-E or the Consumer Price Index for the elderly to calculate annual inflation adjustments for Social Security benefits. Again, insert VA. In summary, the researchers found that using the measure for cost of living decisions would create a more generous Social Security benefit, but also risk being less accurate. I don't know. Look, I'm not the person that's sitting there with my glasses figuring this thing out, right? But you would think that there's probably more elderly utilizing Social Security than not, and therefore accuracy would kind of be. I would think that to be accurate, you would want it to be closer tied to the recipients of that benefit. I'm just saying. So I don't know how it would be less accurate. Now, one thing that I do know is there's less data points maybe in the CPI-E. It's a smaller kind of bucket to work with versus the CPI-W. So, I mean, whatever. Moving on, the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks several measures of inflation. The price index used to calculate the cost of living adjustment for Social Security currently is the CPI-W, or the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners, which is always weird to me because you're typically not a wage earner if you're receiving Social Security, typically. But they use that as the benchmark, whatever. And remember that it's the last quarter of the fiscal year that's utilized, the July, August, and September timeframe to calculate that as well. So moving on, it says the CPI-E is another measure of inflation that focuses on spending habits of elderly and uses a different weighting system based on how those aged 62 or older tend to spend their money, since they have different spending habits and will throw out their needs, right? So people who are elderly and disabled, right, because we can kind of lump in disabled veterans to kind of just have the umbrella fill out there, if you will, have different spending needs as well. So moving on, the CPI-E is higher most years than the CPI-W because it is weighted more heavily toward expenses for health, and inflation in healthcare has outpaced most other industries. According to the CRS report, the CPI-W adjustment from 1985 to 2024 was 188%. That is the CPI-W, the one that's currently used. But it would have been 211% had the CPI-E been used instead. The report also noted that the COLA for 2024 was 3.2%, but would have been 4% under the CPI-E. This would have increased the average monthly benefit from 1907 to 1922. Though researchers note that depending on other factors, the CPI-E would not always outperform its CPI-W counterpart. Hence, a piece of legislation that was introduced by, I believe it was Gallego out of Arizona, that I did a video on, that states that utilize the CPI-E unless it's less than the CPI-W, then you use the CPI-W. So essentially you're using both indices to calculate. You take the higher of the two, and that's what you go with. So, which is a great safety net aspect to doing something like that. You don't want something to backfire and be less. So I love that approach. And here's a thought. For the fact that it was 211% versus the 188% from 1985 to 2024, here's a thought. How about do a back pay for everybody for the percentage difference, and then just implement the CPI-E with the default of unless it's lower than the CPI-W. That would be a fantastic move, I think. Moving on, some advocate, or there's no S, some advocate. Advocate. Some advocate that this measure should be used to calculate the COLA for Social Security, and there is pending legislation to do just that. The Social Security Expansion Act, introduced in February 2023 by Senators Bernie Sanders in Vermont and Warren in Massachusetts, would require the use of CPI-E for Social Security COLA. Now, I will say that in that piece of legislation, that's one little tiny piece of this big legislation on how to revamp the Social Security system, which obviously would be needed, but it's a little harder to kick something like that over the finish line because there's so many components to it. Now, the one from Gallego and others out there that have been pushed out and established pieces of legislation that have been pushed out just call for the simple change it from CPI-W to CPI-E, and let's move forward. Now, the one with Gallego actually has that safety net of unless it's less than the CPI-W, then you use the CPI-W. So something like that would be an easier win, I think, for us. Now, moving forward, Joel Escovitz, the Senior Director of Social Security and Savings at AARP, says that AARP supports using the CPI-E as a more accurate measure to calculate the Social Security COLA. I will also throw out there that the Senior Citizens League has also, for a very long time, proposed and suggested and support that move as well. However, it goes on to say, there are some methodological issues with its use of the CPI-E. Currently has no official usage, despite being tracked by BLS since 1982, according to the researchers. Those include the CPI-E is a measure of weighted inflation for those age 62 and older, and not those collecting Social Security. Okay, but it does give an indication, right? The weighting system for the CPI-E is also based on the consumer price, I'm missing part of the word. I'm guessing consumer expenditures survey, which does not specifically sample those 62 and older, resulting in a small sample size, which again, that's kind of what I had mentioned, and a higher sampling error. And the CPI-E also does not account for the geographical distribution of those 62 and older, which is non-random and does not not account for senior discount, whatever the heck that means. All right, so moving on, it goes on here to say, I'm switching this around a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read, hopefully. All right, so let's see. I'm scrolling around to find the part where I want. All right, I found it. Sorry about that. Eskovitz, or however you say it, explains that the CPI-E is only experimental and is subject to a higher sampling error because the BLS uses a much smaller subset of data to create this index than it does with the CPI-W. He adds, we support a COLA that more accurately reflects the spending patterns of older Americans, and for the BLS to better develop a measurement that meets that standard. Eskovitz cautions that the CPI-E is not always a more generous measure than the existing CPI-W. In some years, it underperforms the CPI-W. However, the true impact of the COLA is not felt on a year-to-year basis, but instead is felt over time by a compounding effect, which is kind of the thing I talked about, like compounding interest, right? It's the graduated effect of it all. There it is clear. I don't know why that says it like that. And there it is clear that older Americans would certainly benefit in the long run from a switch to the CPI-E because of its increased accuracy. So the question now, and again, I go back to that one with Gallegos, right? Or Gallego, I forgot his name now. It sounded like when I read through it that there would be, let's find that. It's the proposed legislation called for Boosting Benefits and COLAs Act. That's the name of it. Boosting Benefits and COLAs Act is an attempt to amend Title II of the Social Security Act and require the Commissioner of Social Security to use the Consumer Price Index for elderly, the CPI-E, to calculate the yearly cost of living adjustment, better known as COLA, instead of Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, the CPI-W. Should the CPI-W be higher than the CPI-E, the first should be used instead of the latter. So that's that little safety net, we'll call it provision in there. So again, Gallego, regardless, like I said at the beginning, whether you're trying to buy votes or not, I mean, we have to get this stuff done somehow, some way, and that's typically how you're going to see legislation come through. So, if this is something that you agree with, right, a cost of living adjustment that is tied to the CPI-E with a safety net of unless the CPI-W is higher, utilize that. If you agree with that, you should reach out to your congressional member and let them know that you support the Boosting Benefits and COLAs Act and for all the reasons why. Here's my reason why. It has been extremely obvious that inflation does this, right? Here's the line of inflation, whichever way this camera is facing for you. And here's the line of COLA, cost of living adjustment, that increase to your benefits, whether it be VA benefits, compensation, or Social Security benefits. Sure, they're both trending upward. Great. However, if they're trending upward like this, that gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger the more you go. Ask anybody who has been receiving Social Security for more than 10, 15, 20 years and on a fixed income if they feel the same they did, if they have the same buying power that they did 15 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it is. And the answer is overwhelmingly no. So with that, thanks so much for watching. I appreciate each and every one of you. Have a great one. And remember, if we don't take care of each other, something went wrong.